it can be a little dangerous, I guess, in a meeting like this to bring in the philosophers. We have the potential to be very abstract and up in the clouds. And one can also wonder what kind of expertise we actually have to bring. We're not the scientists with straightforward empirical information, and we're not the lawyers who can tell us about what the current regulatory situation is. So hopefully we can bring out the good side of the philosophers, which is sort of at the interface between various disciplinary perspectives. So hopefully we can do a good job of this bridge building that you're looking for. The theme that I want to look at in my talk is to explore how to identify and especially how to address cases, including that of nanomaterials, where we have choices of scientific definitions or terms, and these can have significant ethical or social ramifications. I want to address this basically in 3 parts in the talk. First, I thought it would be interesting to look at a couple of other examples outside of the nanotechnology context, just to see how this is played out in some other cases, to provide a little context for our thinking over the next couple days. And then the second part of the talk, I want to consider nano in particular. And here, I just want to give some examples of the sorts of issues that arise. That it's worth thinking about exactly what we mean by science-based definitions. And specifically, I just want to note that this is somewhat ambiguous between at least 2 different interpretations. One is we might say, okay, we want a definition for nanomaterials that's determined or settled by scientific considerations. So if we just get the scientists to talk amongst themselves, we can get this all figured out. On the other hand, we could mean that when we call for a science-based definition, we want to be appropriately informed by science, but this may not exclude a role for ethical and social considerations. And so in our role of building bridges here, I want to argue that I don't think we should fall too quickly into the first interpretation. I think that we ought to be looking not only at science, but also at ethical and social considerations. When there are a range of phenomena that can plausibly be labeled or grouped in different ways, for example, cases of wetlands, where you can have varying types of soil and vegetation, varying kinds of physiological effects from toxicants, there may be multiple definitions that are reasonable from a scientific perspective. The other thing I would just point out is some of the kinds of ethical and social considerations we might want to keep in mind when we're choosing definitions and terms. Partly we may want to be thinking about, well, what are the effects on public perceptions and attitudes of some definitions or some terms as opposed to others? We can see very much, and I especially want to emphasize in the case of the wetlands and in the case of endocrine disruptors, the effect on the burden of proof for taking regulatory action, how you set up your groupings and your definitions. We also need to consider, how are these definitions and terms going to be used by various interest groups or policymakers? And then, as Professor Hall nicely highlighted, given the wording of how your legal statutes are going to be set up, you need to consider, well then, how do we want our definitions to be set up in order to fit with these legal statutes? We may also want to be considering communication between scientists and the public, and effects on the future course of research. There's interesting discussions in philosophy of science on how particular kinds of metaphors or uses of language can be particularly fruitful in research. Again, a potential consideration to keep in mind. Labeling things based on being nanomaterials or using the category of nanotechnology is a bit like classifying things based on the fact that they're blue. It's just not a very good category. It covers all sorts of different phenomena and may not categorize things the way we actually want them to be categorized. At least one way to think about melding our discussion of the science and the social together is through these kinds of deliberative approaches that we heard from Professor Gustin, but there may be other interesting ways of melding these different considerations together as well.
What is this special place, though, in terms of, in some sense, intellectual location? There is a kind of familiar model that you might be, that many people are also expecting and always bringing to the philosophers. And the familiar model comes, in some sense, from a different realm, especially the realm of medical ethics and bioethics. And according to that familiar model, there's, first of all, philosophy, and then within philosophy, you have something called ethics or philosophical ethics. And then it evolved something that is now called applied ethics, including medical ethics, bioethics. And here we have ethical perspectives being brought on, a very special kind of also new development, new therapies, new phenomena, reproductive technologies, and so forth. Philosophy of science and science studies have been very much involved, and of course many people speaking here today Kevin and David, two examples, have been very much involved in the kind of societal and ethical deliberations. So, and it begins in some sense really with the question, what is nanotechnology? That in some sense, regulation and policy and societal and ethical deliberation make no sense at all if they are not cognizant of the complexities of nanoscale phenomena and the kind of knowledge that can be obtained in this about nano phenomena. So what to do? I think there are three things that one can do. The first thing that one could do is wait for scientific knowledge that may never come. So the question is, how does one maybe move on and not be paralyzed by this condition? So there is, of course, a notion of waiting in a precautionary fashion, and I can't go into this right now, what that actually involves. I think for the time being, I would argue that it is just a very conflicted state to be in. But I think there's another way, and I think it's actually the way that society has chosen. Namely, that is the learn as we go along way. I think this is the de facto way in which we are proceeding as societies in Europe and the United States and everywhere else with nanotechnologies. But the question with that particular way is, how can we be sure that we are actually learning? Okay, so how should we think about this learning as we go along? I have two requirements that I want to talk about. The first requirement, I think, for a successful learning process is not to fixate on these unattainable goals. In other words, not to be paralyzed by an expectation that will not be met. All right, so the second point, and this is, again, already the last point, or I don't know, finally the last point of this presentation, about how do we do this learning as we go along process. That when I say that in order to learn as we go along, we need lots of different kinds of data and input and evidences, and we shouldn't necessarily expect that they add up. We also need, in some sense, institutional settings in which observation, collecting, and interpretation of various kinds of evidence can take place. Okay, what are the instruments and institutions of learning that we might be talking about here? So on the one hand, as I mentioned before, there is this expansion, in some sense, of sources of knowledge, and I don't think they should be sorted strictly according to some definition of what is nanotechnology and what isn't. So maybe we can include experiences with welders' fumes, including also then the experience with the way of protecting welders or of atmospheric transport of welders' fumes. I don't know what kind of studies are being done here or not. Then there are also, of course, the old institutions, and I don't think we should underestimate the role of the old institutions, the institutions that are in place and that are working. Just the normal kinds of environmental hazard type regulatory agencies, the EPAs and so forth. So these institutions, even if we say that they might have a hard time coming to terms with the new challenges of nanomaterials, and that actually for much of their work to be done, they don't now have the requisite knowledge perhaps, but they will still have their instruments, they still have their mechanisms and procedures and protocols, and in some sense, they are probing and expanding the efficacy of their available tools, and we have to watch that. So I think they can do a lot of the work, probably, that has to do with the regulation of nanoparticles. But there are also new institutions evolving, and this is the really interesting part where I'm saying that this is already happening. These new institutions are sometimes called observatories, for example, lots of observatories popping up around the world, observatories of nanotechnology, the Centers for Nanotechnology and Society, I would argue, are institutions of vigilance in a society. So the public engagement exercises, the consumer conference, the early work on ethical, legal, social aspects is part of the society being engaged in this process of observing how does nanotechnology development actually unfold. There are also governance initiatives that might be of interest. I'm not going to go into this. The European Code of Conduct, for instance, for responsible nanotechnology research has been presented as an instrument to build a kind of co-responsibility. It's not a regulatory framework in its own right, but it's a kind of challenge to scientists, to science organizations, to policymakers in the European member states to respond in a certain way and to give meaning to very vague principles in part. So, and generally speaking, the whole project here is how do, in the absence of reliable knowledge about regulatory thresholds, how do societies earn and build trust, or how do actors in society earn and build trust in kind of living with this uncertainty?
Now, FDA divides products in my part of my world by mode of action. And I'll show you the statutes. Drugs work chemically. Devices work non-chemically. So the question we've got is, how do we decide what a nano product is? So the question is, what's the difference? The difference is in the mode of action. The difference is under a device which does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action. Now, our objectives in this project was to define for this drug-device interaction what is, quote, chemical action in a way that makes sense scientifically, that meets the legal regulatory needs, that we can apply consistently across products, we have some uniformity, and is something that people can actually apply.
Our idea is that, look, rather than give a strict definition at this point, we've been working on what we like to call an algorithm for dividing between devices and drugs, but we don't have an algorithm yet, so we have more of a heuristic. It's built on these 4 principles. The four principles are just these: the chemicality principle, which, by the way, I don't think is a word, but sounds awesome. The singularity principle, the locality principle, the causality principle. So together we want to say these will distinguish between drug regulation and device regulation for anything. So this is a bit of progress again. The related problem has begun to resolve. We know that the article, according to the singularity principle, we're going to look at the effect of the article and not something else, must increase the probability, that's the causality principle, of some effect when explained chemically, and that's the chemicality principle. So we're almost there, got our 3 principles in there. So the effect we're interested in is treatment. We know the 2 things that are to be related, that is the article under chemical, I only have one thing there. The treatment, whatever the treatment's going to be. So remember, it says we're looking at the intended treatment. And the article, which is the thing that's being introduced, in this case, some piece of nanomaterial. So the final piece of this puzzle is what we are going to call the locality principle. And the locality principle just requires that the article undergo a change in chemical shape at the site of treatment. So not somewhere upstream or somewhere downstream. I mean, one of the reasons we're interested in this particular issue is because imagine you ingest something in a pill and it dissolves. It will undergo a change of chemical shape. But that's not the article that's undergoing it. It's the way in which it was introduced. Or somebody injects something into you. I mean, that's clearly a device. But you have to look at the point at which the treatment occurs to determine whether or not something operates chemically. So then, in conclusion, such as our conclusion is, the four elements combine to rationally define the separate realms. So we have the legal realm in which we need a distinction between drug and device. We have the philosophical realm where we want an answer to things like physicalism and be able to talk about chemistry as a kind of real thing. And that was the point about the stuff about explanation. And then we have, lastly, the engineering questions. Like, how does nanosilver work? We need to know that. And so I only pointed to the stuff that I could understand. Hopefully people will be able to fill in the blanks a little bit there. If not, still not really very well understood. But we need to know a little bit more about how the nanosilver works before we could say for certain it was one thing or another. And our definition is, of course, supposed to be principled, logical, practical, and consistent. So we're hoping that when our algorithm is done, that will be all of those things. And the heuristic, it looks like it actually does some work here. It tells us the difference between nanoparticles, which we have classified as a drug, at least according to our heuristic, and glue, which turned out to be a device. Thank goodness, right? So that's it for us. Hopefully we'll have some questions, comments, and suggestions. And thank you for having us and listening.